Many viewers of this channel have shown themselves to fit the bill of monster fanatic, and will no doubt be aware of the reputation of monster films in general as, shall we say, below par. But for those who have spent a lifetime absorbing creature features, odds are you've probably seen some monstrous spectacles that were truly extraordinary. Perhaps you've been touched by moving themes and storytelling, or stunned by marvelous special effects. At such times, you may have felt compelled to question the overall perception of the rank and file that these movies are just silly nonsense and not worthy of attention. And then, of course, there are others. Today, we'll be looking at 3 such others. Movies which have long been dismissed by monster fans and laymen alike as the worst of the worst. We'll determine just what makes them so awful, and maybe even find some redemption for these poor, maligned creations along the way. I'm Tyler Martin, and this is Monsters from the Id. Let's start things big with one of the most notorious creature flicks of all time, 1957's The Giant Claw from Columbia Pictures. Produced by Sam Katzman and directed by Fred F. Sears, this B-movie classic needs no introduction for those well-seasoned in monster cinema. For those who may need to be brought up to speed, the story unfolds thusly. During a radar test flight in the frozen wastes of the far north, engineer Mitch McAfee sights an enormous UFO. Of 3 fighter jets sent to intercept, 1 is lost in the encounter. Soon after, McAfee and fellow researcher Sally Caldwell run afoul of a similar object, which forces their plane to crash land in the Adirondack Mountains. They are rescued by a farmer, who subsequently witnesses a giant bird, which he identifies as La Cacagne, after a local legend. McAfee's suspicions about the identity of the UFO are met with scorn, but after more aircraft disappear, his views begin to gain acceptance. With the help of the United States military, Mitch and Sally scramble to cope with what turns out to be a colossal buzzard from an antimatter galaxy, which appears dead set on mass destruction. Long considered to be about as bad as movies get, The Giant Claw is remembered almost exclusively for its truly absurd monster, and the singular manner in which it is frequently described by characters in the film.
Something as big as a battleship had just flown over and past him.
Yeah. Flying battleship that wasn't there. That was no false alarm, believe
come
me.
off it, Mitch. You've done enough harm with your flying battleship. Just
a moment, Miss Karl.
But while these undeniably hokey elements hardly flatter the picture, there are other factors worth considering. The story itself is pretty standard 1950s fare, following a well-established formula with hefty doses of questionable science, but not quite sinking to such lows as the work of, say, Ed Wood or Larry Buchanan. In fact, it easily matches the livelier Roger Corman productions of the era, and while that may not be an indicator of superlative cinema, it does constitute a mark in the film's favor, comparatively speaking. The most remarkable aspect of The Giant Claw, however, is the film's cast, which includes genre veterans Jeff Morrow, Mara Corday, and Morris Ankrum, all of whom offer truly sincere performances, which elevate the film considerably. In later interviews, Morrow and Corday stated that during filming, the actors had no idea what the creature was going to look like, and used their imaginations to fill in the blanks. Appalled by the finished product, Morrow is said to have snuck out early from a theatrical screening when the monster was met with endless laughter from the audience, and reportedly drove home to drink himself to sleep. Bottom line, The Giant Claw is no masterpiece. But is it really all that bad? This reviewer thinks not. In spite of its conspicuous flaws, this movie is hardly the turkey, or buzzard, it's made out to be. Next up, a trip to my second home, Japan, for Noriaki Yuasa's near-universally abused Gamera super monster. Few would argue that this entry is a high point for the Gamera franchise, being made under less than ideal conditions and an abysmally low budget. But it can't be all bad, can it? In the years leading up to the 1970s, Daiei, one of Japan's biggest movie studios, was suffering an uncontrollable downward spiral and had been kept afloat by strong box office returns from Yuasa's Gamera films, which had proved very popular with children, alongside the phenomenal success of the Zatoichi series. However, by 1971, not even Blind Swordsman and Flying Super Turtles could save Daiei from its monetary woes, and the studio went bankrupt. Without a place to call home, Gamera slipped into hibernation for the remainder of the decade. At last, in late 1979, a decision was made to revive the character in an effort to help drag Daiei out of its sorry state. The result was Gamera Super Monster, which concerns the exploits of a trio of alien heroines as they combat Zanon, an invading extraterrestrial force. A young boy, Keiichi, encounters these punch-packing superwomen and tells them all about the valiant monster Gamera, who can defend the Earth from any threat. With the help of copious amounts of stock footage from previous films, Zanon resorts to resurrecting Gamera's past foes to lay waste to Japan's cities and take the heroic monster out for good. While the exact figure is unclear, Yuasa and his staff were given substantially less funding to work with than usual on Super Monster, and the limitations of this arrangement are all too apparent in the finished film. The new effects sequences are of flimsy quality, and the design for the Zanon spaceship is shamelessly swiped from Star Wars. But is it really that bad? It's easy to rag on the excessive stock footage, but in fairness, it is recut and incorporated into the new story fairly effectively. The leader of the alien superwomen is played with gusto by wrestler Mach Fumiake, who also sings the film's theme song, and her performance is infectiously charming. Veteran composer Shunsuke Kikuchi, famed for countless ultra-successful works like Dragon Ball and Abarembo Shogun, provides an exceptionally groovy score. While in no way a high point for the series, Gamera Super Monster at least manages to be more entertaining than some of its predecessors. Noriaki Yuasa's love for the character is apparent, even if the execution is lacking. Last, let's have a look at what has long been condemned as an embarrassing low for one of the most iconic characters in movie history. John Guillermin's King Kong Lives, made 10 years after his smash hit remake of King Kong, indeed suffers from no small number of issues, though again, is not without merit. After his tragic fall from the World Trade Center at the climax of the 1976 film, we learn that the mighty Kong has been kept on life support at the Atlantic Institute. Dr. Amy Franklin discovers that the fallen behemoth is in dire need of help in the form of an artificial heart, but in order to complete the operation, a blood transfusion is required, and the obvious question arises: how to find a donor? Luckily, adventurer Hank Mitchell manages to capture a giant female ape in Borneo. In short order, Lady Kong is brought to the Atlantic Institute, where the operation is carried out successfully, but the two quickly fall in love and escape. The Kongs revel in one another's affections and try their best to evade a hostile military, all while concerns about the durability of Kong's artificial heart continue to mount. Not many are likely to submit this offering for consideration as the great ape's finest hour. The 1933 classic King Kong is rightly considered one of the greatest movies ever made, and that's bound to be a mighty hard standard to measure up to. The script is rife with undeniable corniness, the budgetary restrictions are very apparent, and the sight of Mr. and Mrs. Kong playfully caressing one another is sure to elicit a cringe or two. But again, is it really that bad? While many may understandably criticize the premise as far-fetched, the story moves along at a nice clip and remains engaging throughout. And though there is no shortage of cheap sentimentality, it's hard not to feel for Kong and cheer when he comes riding in on a white horse to save his lady, figuratively speaking. This film is clearly determined not to let its imperfections get in the way of a good time, and I feel that it really succeeds in this regard. For all its shortcomings, King Kong Lives manages to be an absolute blast, and certainly not the worst of the Kong movies. So, what do you think? Have I judged fairly, or are these movies really just the pits? Either way, I hope you've had fun watching. Sound off in the comments and let the world know what movies you think really are or aren't all that bad. And as always, thank you for joining me. I'll see you next time.